So we did now translate our Redux-only non-React example, where we also used a counter, to this React application so that there we also manage this counter state with Redux. And we actually do more than what we did initially in this module when we just got started with Redux. Now, in this starting project, which I provided to you, we got a couple of other components as well, not just the counter. We got a couple of other components as well because there's more I wanna practice and teach you when it comes to Redux. And therefore it's now time to use some of these other components. In the app.js file, in this app component, let's now return more than just the counter. Let's add a fragment imported from React, this built-in fragment component, so that we can have a couple of adjacent JSX element. And let's also add our header component here. And for this, we need to import header from /components header. And let's also add the auth component here. And for this, import auth from /components auth. Now, if we do that, we have this little demo application. We still have the counter down there, and we could also remove it. It's not related to this mini demo at all, but I will leave it there so that we still have the Redux state for the counter. And now we're also going to add state for this demo application. But which state? Well, here I would like to make this login form work. Not really, we won't really add authentication here. We do this in a separate course section because there's more to it than a little bit of Redux usage. But I want to make sure that when we click login, we do switch into some login mode. And for example, what we see here in the navigation bar changes. These items and the logout button should only be displayed if we are logged in Redux. And I also want to swap this login field here, this login form, for another component, the user profile component, which has some dummy output. So we have a brand new state to manage. And unlike the counter state, which was just a basic example, the authentication state and the answer to the question whether the user is logged in or not is indeed not just local state, which matters to one specific component, but it is application-wide state, which matters to a lot of components in the application. It matters to the header, it matters to the auth component, it matters to the user profile component in the end. So therefore, this is the user authenticated state is a perfect example for a state that we could manage with React context, or since this section is about Redux, with Redux. And that's therefore what I want to do now. I want to make sure that when we click the login button, we set the user to authenticated. If we click the logout button, I want to set the user to not authenticated. And for this, in our store here, we can add a brand new state, a brand new piece of data. Now the question is where we should add our authentication data. We do have this slice which we created here, this counter slice, and in there we manage the counter and the show counter state. We could, of course, also add a new property to our state here. Let's say the isAuthenticated property and set this to false, and then add a new reducer, login, for example, a new reducer method, and in here we then set isAuthenticated to true. We could do this, but logically it makes no sense. The authentication status has nothing to do with the counter. Whilst it would technically work, in programming, we typically want to separate our concerns. We want to make sure that this slice really focuses on the counter-related state and actions. And we should create a brand new slice for the authentication state. And that's therefore what I'll do. I'll rename this initial state up here to the initial counter state, because we will soon have more than one initial state. And therefore I set the initial state property in this slice to the value stored in initial counter state. And then we can add a new slice below the other slice, though the exact position does not matter. But we can call create slice again to create another slice. And this slice also, of course, needs an object to be configured, just as our first slice. This slice will be configured in exactly the same way, just with different values. So we add a name here and set this to auth, for example, or authentication, whatever you want. And we also want to assign some initial state here. Now we could create this on the fly here, or again create a separate constant which holds this initial state. And that's what I'll do here. I'll add a const initial auth state, which again, let's say is an object, where we have the isAuthenticated property, which initially is set to false. And then here I set initial state equal to this initial auth state value. And then we need to register our reducers, these reducer methods which can change this state. And here I think two methods make sense. A login method for, well, logging the user in, and a logout method for logging the user out. In both methods, we'll receive the current state as an argument, automatically provided by Redux, and we can then mutate this state, even though we technically shouldn't, but as I explained, we can do it here because under the hood, our code will be transformed to actually not mutate the original state, so it's safe to do that here. And we can set state isAuthenticated equal to true here in the login state, and here in the logout state, set isAuthenticated to false. And that could be our slice for the auth part. So I'll store this in an auth slice constant. Up here we have the counter slice. Now I have the auth slice as a second slice. And now we want to add that to our Redux store. Now, very important, when you work with multiple slices, you still only have one Redux store. So you still only call configure store once. This does not change. And this store only has one root reducer here. But as I briefly explained earlier, this reducer actually does not just take a reducer function as an argument, but also an object which acts as a map of reducers, where you can then have any key names of your choice, for example, counter, and then point at your different reducers. Here, for example, at counterslice.reducer. And then we also add auth, let's say, as a key. And then here we add auth slice.reducer. And these individual reducers here will then automatically be merged together into one main reducer, which is exposed to this store. That's how we can combine multiple slices and their reducers. Now, our auth slice, of course, also exposes actions which we can use, and therefore I want to expose those as well. So export auth actions, which is authSlice.actions. So now we added this auth slice. Let's now use it in our different components. And of course, definitely feel free to try this on your own first. Tap into the store and use the auth state to conditionally show the auth component or the user profile component in app, and in the header to conditionally show these items or not show them. And make sure that you dispatch the login and logout actions in the appropriate places. Just one important hint, since we are merging our reducers together here, the way we access data in our store changes slightly, and we will need to adjust this for the counter as well. If we currently have a look at our application, you see the counter is not being output down there, because we failed to extract it from the store. In the counter component, our code hasn't changed, but the code here changed. All we have to do to make it work again is go to our selectors, so to use selector, and when we drill into our state to read a value from there, we now need to use these identifiers, which we assigned in this reducer map, to drill into our specific state slices. So for counter, I use counter as an identifier here. Hence in the counter component, when we want to access the counter, it's actually state.counter.counter. This might look strange, but with the first .counter, we make React Redux aware of the fact that we want to dive into this slice in the end, into the state produced by this slice's reducer. And then in that state slice, we simply have a property named counter. If that would be named differently, if that would be value, then in the counter component, it would be state.counter.value. But since it isn't value but counter, I'll revert it and revert it there as well. And that's why we have state.counter.counter. And for show counter, it's state.counter.showCounter. So when you do try this on your own for the off slice, you should take this into account when you read data from the store. And with that, try it on your own. We're going to do it together in the next lecture. Were you successful? Let's do it together. And for this, let's maybe start in the app component and render the auth component if we're not authenticated, and render user profile if we are authenticated. So for this, I'll also import user profile from /components user profile. And then here, we need to tap into our store and read a value from there. And we do that with use selector. So I'll import use selector from React Redux. And in the app component function, we therefore call use selector, pass a function to it, a function which will always receive state as an argument. That's passed in by Redux, or by React Redux to be precise. And then here I want to return state.auth, because I picked auth as an identifier here. And then in my auth slice, I have this isAuthenticated property. So it's state.auth.isAuthenticated. And that gives me the isAuth value. Of course, this constant can be named however you want. And we can use this to check if we're not, hence the exclamation mark, if we're not authenticated, then I want to show the auth component. Else, if isAuth is truthy, I want to render user profile. And if everything works, if we save, we should still see that auth form. Now we also got some conditional content to render here in the header, and therefore we can go into the header.js file and do the same thing here. We import use selector from React Redux, and then here we create our isAuth property, our constant I mean, call use selector, and use the same selection logic for diving into state.auth.isAuthenticated. And now we can use isAuth to conditionally render or not render those list items. And since in this case, actually the entire navigation is only relevant if we are authenticated, we can also just render the entire nav item conditionally. If isAuth is truthy, then I want to render this nav, like this. If we now save that and reload, we don't see anything here because initially we are not authenticated. Now I want to dispatch the login action if the login button is clicked. I actually won't even bother to read the user input. I will not validate it. You can do all of that, but that's not related to Redux. So I will just care about the form submission with that login button. Hence, here in the auth component, we want to add an onSubmit listener on the form here, and then add a new function in the auth component, the submit or the login handler, where we get the default event, which we still should use to prevent the default, to make sure React doesn't send a HTTP request, or the browser sends a HTTP request to be precise. You learned about that in the forms section. And then with that wired up, in that login handler, after preventing the default, I want to dispatch that login action. Now for this, we want to use the auth actions, which we're exporting, and use dispatch. So in the auth.js file, we import use dispatch from React Redux. And in addition, I also want to import from, going up one level, store index. And from there, I want to import the auth actions. And then here in the auth component, we execute use dispatch to get access to that dispatch function. And in the login handler, we then use the dispatch function to dispatch auth actions.login. We execute login because you learned that this is an action creator returning the actual action object which should be dispatched. If we do that and save everything, if we reload and click on login, we switch to the login state, as we can tell by the changes on the UI. So that works. Last but not least, let's wire up the logout button here. And for this, in the header where we got the logout button, I'll add an onClick listener on that button, and then add a function here to the header component, the logout handler, where I want to dispatch my action. So again, just as before, for this we import use dispatch, and we import our auth actions from store index. We then call use dispatch in the component function to get access to that dispatch function. And in the login handler, we then dispatch, we call dispatch, and to it we pass auth actions.logout, executed as a method again, because that then creates that logout action object. Now we need to wire up the logout handler to onClick, and we should be good to go. If I now click on logout, I'm logged out. If I click on login, I'm logged back in. So that is working, and that is how we can work with multiple totally different pieces of data in one and the same application. And that is something you will need in almost any React application you're going to build. You will always just have one Redux store, but then typically multiple different state slices, which manage totally different data. And as you see, it's super easy to create and manage multiple slices when using Redux Toolkit. Now, to come to an end in this module, where we learned a lot of important things, I want to split up this index.js file in the store folder. It's actually a quite small file, not too much code in it. But of course, in your typical React application, where you have multiple state slices, this can become a very long file. So therefore, it might be worth splitting it up into smaller pieces. And when using Redux Toolkit, it could make sense to put every slice into its own file. So we could add a new file in the store folder, let's say the counter slice.js file, or just counter.js. The file name is up to you. And then we want to create and manage the counter specific state and slice in there. So we would grab the initial counter state and the entire counter slice, cut that, and add it in the counter.js file. Now to use create slice, we of course now need to import that here. So we import create slice from @redux.js toolkit. And we still also need to use counter slice in a different file thereafter. So we should export it. For example, as a default export, we can export counter slice. Now we can do the same for auth. So I'll add a auth.js file and take my initial auth state and the auth slice, cut that from the index.js file and move it into auth.js, and then also import create slice here from @redux toolkit. And then also here, export this default auth slice. Now in index.js, we want to merge all those slices together. Therefore, we can remove create slice in there. We don't need that import anymore because we're not creating any slices in this file anymore. Instead, we focus on creating that main store and merging all the slice reducers together. Hence, we can now import the counter slice from /counter. Or, since we only really need the reducer in here, we actually go to the counter and we just export the reducer. So we don't export the entire slice, but just its reducer part. By doing that in index.js, we could import the counter reducer here, since that is what we're exporting as a default, and then just assign that as a reducer to counter, the counter reducer. And do the same for auth.js. Just export the reducer here, and in index.js, then therefore import the auth reducer from /auth. And assign this as a value for the auth key in that reducer map. Now regarding the actions, I want to export those from the files into which they belong. So the counter actions should be exported here in the counter.js file, still by accessing .actions and exporting that as a named export. And the same for auth. I'll grab that export in index.js and move that into auth.js. Now with that, if we save this, we'll need to fix a couple of imports. In counter.js, for example, where I try to import counter actions from the index file, we now need to import them from the counter file in the store folder. In auth.js, we need to import auth actions from the auth file in the store folder. In header, we need to import auth actions from the auth file as well. And in user profile, we're not using anything of that. But if we now save that, if we reload, it works just as before. All the state works as before. But now we're splitting this up, and in bigger applications, that can ensure that our code stays maintainable and is easier to manage. Because now we have a lean index.js file, and then pretty lean files for our different state slices, which are then focused on one specific type of state. Not required here, but definitely helpful in bigger applications, and even here, it certainly doesn't hurt. Now that is it for this course section. Was again another long section, but it was about a super important topic, Redux. And you did learn initially how you can set up Redux without React, and then how you can set it up without Redux Toolkit. Now, Redux Toolkit is amazing, and my strong recommendation is to use it because, as you saw throughout this course section, it's much easier to manage your state and your reducers and your actions when using Toolkit instead of having to set up everything on your own. Still, it's important to know what happens behind the scenes, which is why I did start without Redux Toolkit, so that you really know everything about Redux which you need to know, and so that you're also able to dive into projects that might not be using Redux Toolkit, but just Redux. Now then you learn about these core Redux concepts and this Redux flow. You learned about actions and reducers, or this one root reducer, and about the fact that Redux has this one central data store. That we can create this store with configure store when using Redux Toolkit, and that then as an argument we pass in an object where we assign our root reducer. We either point at just one reducer function, or we set up such a map of reducers which are then merged together into one big reducer behind the scenes. Now we also learned how we can then use our Redux managed data. That we can use selector in our components to read data from our Redux managed state, and that we can use dispatch to get access to that dispatch function, which we use to dispatch our actions, which then ultimately leads to our Redux state being changed. We also learned that we can pass extra data to those actions because you often have actions and reducer functions, therefore, which do need extra data. We also learned how we would connect a class-based component to Redux. We're not going to use that in this course, and you might not see it too often out there, but on the other hand, there are a lot of projects which still only use class-based components, so that's definitely also something you should be aware of. And therefore now we have a very solid foundation when it comes to Redux. Redux is an amazing library. It can replace React Context, as you learned, but it's also not a must-use library. It's always up to you to decide whether for your project you want to go with React Context or if you need Redux. React Context can have certain disadvantages, as I mentioned, but they might not matter in your project. You might not see or measure any performance issues, and you might not have a super complex setup and management. Then, of course, there's nothing wrong with sticking to React Context. Because you must not forget that if you use Redux, you do add an extra third-party library. And that, of course, adds up to the overall code of your application. It makes your application bigger. So Redux is not always better. It can be a decent option, and now you know how it works and when you should maybe consider it. Now we are going to work more with it throughout the course, but this is now a solid foundation which you need as a React developer.